I still remember the smell of that morning like it's trapped somewhere deep in my bones. The smell of wet soil after a long night of Texas rain. It wasn't just the kind of drizzle that freshens up the grass. It had poured hard, rattling my old tin roof until past midnight. The world outside looked freshly scrubbed when I stepped out onto the porch. Sky washed pale gray. Puddles rippling in the driveway and that cool, earthy scent that always made me think of my father's farm. I was holding a chipped coffee mug, steam curling up in the quiet air. My dog Rusty, an old mutt with more heart than sense, sat beside me on the porch steps, his tail lazily tapping against the wood. I remember thinking it was going to be a peaceful day. Maybe mow the backfield, maybe clean out the shed. Simple plans, ordinary things. Then I saw the car. A white county sheriff's sedan easing down my gravel driveway, tires crunching against the wet stone. For a second, I thought maybe it was a routine check or something about the storm, but the moment I saw the deputy step out, hat low, clipboard in hand, I felt a strange chill in my gut. He wasn't there for small talk. You can tell when a man's carrying bad news by the way he looks at you. "Morning," he said, his tone polite but distant. "Morning, officer. Everything all right?" He looked down at his clipboard, then back at me. "Mr. William Carter." "That's me," he nodded once, tight and formal. Then came those 3 words that crack open a man's world like thunder splitting the sky. "You've been served." He handed me an envelope, thick, official, with my name printed in black bold letters. My fingers tightened around it before my brain could even catch up. Rusty let out a low growl, sensing something was off. And then across the road I saw him, Henry Miller, my neighbor, my so-called friend, standing there in his yard with that smug grin plastered across his face, arms crossed, chin high, as if this moment was something he'd been waiting for. He didn't even have the decency to look away. No guilt, no shame, just that infuriating smirk. It took me a few seconds to process what was happening. I tore open the envelope right there on my porch, hands shaking, and began to read. A lawsuit. He was suing me, claiming that a strip of my land, about 40 feet along the fence line, was legally his. 40 feet that, according to some old survey from God knows when, supposedly belonged to the Miller property. 40 feet. It might not sound like much to anyone else, but that strip wasn't just dirt and weeds. It was history. It held the old cedar shed my grandfather built with his bare hands back in the 1950s. I'd spent half my boyhood summers in that shed, learning how to sharpen tools and mend fences. My father stored his tractor there until the day he passed. Every nail in that wood carried a memory, and now Henry was saying it wasn't mine. I stood there staring at that paper as the morning light began to push through the thinning clouds. I could feel something boiling under my skin. Anger, confusion, disbelief, all tangled up in a knot in my chest. I looked up again, and there he was, still watching me, still smirking. "Henry," I called out. My voice cracked through the quiet air. "What the hell is this?" He didn't even flinch. "Just following the law, Will," he said, loud enough for the whole road to hear. "It's about time the property line got fixed right." The property line, that's what he called it. As if it were some trivial thing, just a few feet of soil. He knew damn well what it meant to me. We'd been neighbors for years. We'd shared more than just fences. I'd fixed his truck when his starter went bad. Lent him my chainsaw when that old oak tree nearly fell on his roof. When his wife slipped her back, I was the one who carried her groceries and checked in on her when he was working out of town. And this was how he repaid me. The deputy gave a polite nod and turned back to his car. I could hear the gravel crunching as he drove away, leaving me standing there on my porch. A piece of paper in one hand, a cold cup of coffee in the other, and the taste of betrayal thick in my mouth. For a long time, I didn't move. I just stared out toward that fence line, the same line I'd painted, trimmed, and repaired over the years. The same fence I thought represented neighborly respect. It hit me then. I had no idea what I was walking into. I thought it was just a dispute over land, a misunderstanding that could be cleared with a calm talk and some common sense. But that wasn't what this was. This wasn't about property. It wasn't even about the shed. It was about pride. Henry wanted to break something inside me, maybe because of envy, maybe because of something darker that had been festering in him all along. I couldn't tell, but I saw it in his eyes that morning. He wanted a fight. I remember setting my coffee down on the porch rail and taking one last look at the paper. The legal words blurred for a second as the wind picked up. Trespass, encroachment, unlawful possession. Big words for something so small. But that's the thing about small-town disputes. They start with inches and end with lives torn apart. I went back inside, dropped the papers on the kitchen table, and just stood there for a while. The clock ticked on the wall. The house felt quieter than it had in years. Rusty came over, pressing his head against my leg like he knew I needed grounding. I wish I could say I handled it calmly that day. But I didn't. I slammed my fist against the table so hard the coffee spilled. I swore under my breath. I wanted to march across that road and demand an explanation, but I didn't. Something deep down told me not to, because this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a war, and wars, and even the quiet, legal ones, take everything out of you. That morning, as the clouds broke and sunlight hit the edge of my land, I told myself one thing: I will not lose what my family built. Not to greed, not to lies, not to him. I didn't know then just how far this battle would go. The sleepless nights, the courtroom games, the twisted rumors that would crawl through the town like wildfire. But when it finally ended, it didn't just end in victory. It ended with me standing on the very ground he tried to steal. Ground that by law and by life was now mine. I didn't just win the lawsuit. I owned his land. Before all that nonsense and before the lawyers, the courthouse, and the cold stares across the property line, life was simple. Peaceful even. I had no reason to think my neighbor would one day become my enemy. We were just two aging men trying to make sense of our days in a town that had stopped changing long ago. Auburn Springs. Texas isn't much more than a handful of streets, a post office, and a diner that serves the same pancakes they did 20 years ago. Folks there live slow. You hear the same stories every Sunday at church, and the same gossip at the barber shop every Friday morning. The kind of place where time crawls, not walks. My house sat on 3 acres just off Maple Road. My father bought that land back when gas was 30 cents a gallon, and life was measured by how straight you could build a fence. The soil out there isn't rich. It's dry and stubborn, but it holds a man's sweat like memory. I'd raised 2 kids on that land, buried 2 dogs under the big oak tree, and watched 3 generations of seasons roll through those fields. Every sound, the creak of the porch swing, the crunch of gravel under my boots, was part of my rhythm. When Henry Miller moved in next door about 8 years ago, the neighborhood felt different for a while. New blood on the block, though he wasn't exactly young himself. He'd just retired from some construction company up in Dallas and said he was looking for peace and quiet. He got both, at least at first. Henry was tall, lean, and had that leathery kind of skin men get from working outside their whole lives. His hands were rough, scarred with old calluses that told me he'd swung a hammer longer than most men hold a marriage. His wife Marlene was the opposite. Soft-spoken, sweet, with that gentle drawl you hear in women who've seen more hardship than they'll ever admit. The first few years, things were fine. We weren't drinking buddies, but we respected each other. He'd wave from his porch, I'd wave back. Sometimes we'd chat over the fence about football. Cowboys versus Texans, every year the same argument. He always said the Cowboys were cursed. I told him hope dies hard in Texas. There were summer barbecues where he'd bring over his famous ribs and I'd bring beer. Once, when my mower broke down, he lent me his without hesitation. Another time I helped him rebuild part of his tool shed after a storm tore half the roof off. There was trust, or at least what I thought was trust. Our wives got along too. My late wife, Ellen, used to bake pecan pies and drop one off at their place every Thanksgiving. I remember hearing their laughter from the porch one night when they had us over for dinner. It felt good back then. 2 couples side by side, growing old quietly, trading stories and favors like good neighbors do. But things changed after Marlene passed away. I still remember the day of her funeral. The whole town showed up. Auburn Springs may be small, but folks know how to show respect. Henry stood at the graveside like a statue. Not a tear, not a word, just a clenched jaw and eyes that stared through everything. I went up to him after, put a hand on his shoulder and said, "If you ever need anything, you know where I am." He just nodded. But his eyes told a different story, the kind of hollow look that stays when grief turns into something darker. After that, he started keeping to himself. He stopped coming to the diner, stopped waving over the fence. The cheerful man who once shared ribs and beer now barely said a word. His yard started to go wild, weeds climbing the fence, tools left rusting in the rain. I thought it was just grief. Everyone handles loss differently, right? But it wasn't just that. He became bitter about everything. First, it was my dog, Rusty. "Will, that mutt barks all night," he snapped one afternoon when I was checking my mail. Some of us like to sleep. Rusty was old, half deaf, half lazy, barely had the energy to bark at his own reflection, but I apologized anyway. Then it was my truck. He'd come by, arms folded, and say, "You mind parking that beast a few feet farther? You're blocking my view." His view was a patch of dirt and 2 mesquite trees, but I moved it anyway. I told myself he was just lonely, looking for something to control. Then he started complaining about my oak trees. Said the shade reached too far into his yard, that the leaves clogged his gutter. I trimmed them back even though half those branches were on my side. No matter what I did, it was never enough. He started walking the property lines more and more often, muttering under his breath. I'd see him out there early in the mornings, pacing like a man waiting for a fight. One afternoon, I came home from town and caught him standing on the edge of my field holding a tape measure. "Henry," I called out, laughing a little, trying to keep it friendly. "What are you up to?" He straightened, coiling the tape back like a snake. "Just checking boundaries," he said flatly. You never know who's encroaching these days. Encroaching. That word didn't fit in a friendly sentence. It stuck to me like a splinter. I laughed it off then, tried to play it down. "You don't have to worry about me stealing a few inches of dirt, Henry. I got more than I can mow already." He didn't laugh back. He just stared, a long, cold stare, then turned and walked away. That night I told myself he was just grieving, that the loneliness had twisted him a little. I didn't know how deep that twist went. Over the next few months he got stranger. He started building things, odd wooden stakes along his fence, painted red at the tips. I asked once what they were for. He said, "Markers, for when I get things measured proper." Measured proper. I didn't know what that meant then, but I should have. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs were all there. Every sigh, every glare, every word soaked in resentment. I just didn't want to believe it. I kept thinking we'd go back to how it was. 2 old men, neighbors, sharing a bit of peace in a small town that forgot how to rush. But peace has a fragile backbone. Once you bend it, it doesn't straighten easy. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about those early days, about how kind he used to be, how we used to laugh at nothing. I think about Marlene's soft voice, and how losing her must have broken something inside him that never healed right. Maybe grief made him cruel. Maybe envy did. Maybe both. All I know is before that storm of lawsuits and lies ever began, there was a stretch of quiet, a kind of false calm, the kind that fools you into thinking life's steady, when underneath it's already cracking. I didn't know it then, but those were the last real peaceful years I'd ever have in Auburn Springs. If I had, maybe I would have seen the storm coming. Maybe I would have been ready when Henry Miller, the man who once shared my dinner table, decided to turn my world upside down over 40 feet of dirt. But I wasn't ready. I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. The morning that envelope landed on my kitchen table, everything inside me went quiet, like the world had paused for a moment to watch me break. The lawsuit papers lay open beside a half-empty cup of coffee, their words printed in bold black letters that felt colder than winter steel. Property encroachment, unlawful occupation. I kept reading those phrases over and over, as if they'd change meaning if I stared hard enough. Henry Miller, my neighbor, the man I once trusted enough to share my tools with, was suing me. It felt absurd, ridiculous, the kind of thing you read about in those legal columns at the back of the local paper. Not something that happens to you. At first, I thought maybe it was a clerical mistake. Maybe the county had mixed something up. Maybe Henry didn't even know about it. That's what I told myself as I picked up the phone. When he answered, I tried to sound calm, even friendly. "Hey, Henry, I just got something strange in the mail." "A lawsuit. It's got your name on it." He didn't even let me finish. His voice came through sharp, bitter, full of old anger I didn't even know existed. "You knew damn well that sheet isn't on your land," he snapped. "You've been trespassing for years, Carter. I've got the old survey to prove it. The words hit me like gravel to the chest. His tone wasn't that of a confused neighbor. It was a man out for blood. "Henry, we can talk about this," I said, my throat tight. "You and I both know that fence has been there long before you even moved in." But he'd already hung up. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone, trying to understand what just happened. The man I'd once helped fix his roof, the man whose wife I'd driven to her doctor's appointments when she was sick, was now painting me as some kind of crook. That night, I called my lawyer, David Nash. We'd known each other since high school. He was a straight shooter, the kind of guy who still said sir to old ladies and brought donuts to court clerks. When he came over the next morning, I had all my property papers spread across the table. He thumbed through the yellowed documents, adjusted his glasses, and sighed. "This is going to be messy, Will," he said quietly. "But you've got solid ground here, literally. Your deed's clean, your boundary markers are consistent, and that shed's been there since before your granddad passed. The law's on your side." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But out in small towns like Auburn Springs, the law isn't always about what's written on paper. It's about who you are, who people believe you to be. And Henry knew that better than anyone. Within days, the rumors started. At the diner, I caught a few folks glancing my way, whispering over their pancakes. At the hardware store, the clerk, who'd known me for 20 years, suddenly became polite but distant. Even at church, the pastor mentioned honesty in our dealings during Sunday sermon, and I could feel the weight of half the congregation's eyes turning toward me. Henry had been busy. He went around town spinning his story, painting himself as the poor old man whose land was stolen by his greedy neighbor. He even showed people some tattered old survey map, something his father apparently had from the 1970s. Most folks didn't question it. They didn't care about dates or measurements. They just loved a scandal, and small towns feed on scandal like cattle on hay. I'd walk down Main Street and conversations would hush. People I'd mowed lawns for, people I'd helped during storms, they suddenly had doubts. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about my reputation, my name. I remember one afternoon my daughter Emily called from Houston. She'd seen something about it on Facebook. One of Henry's grandkids had posted a smug little rant about land thieves and entitled neighbors. "Dad," she said softly, "tell me this isn't true," her voice cracked. And that broke me in a way the lawsuit never could. I told her everything. From the day my grandfather built that shed to the moment I got served. She believed me, but I could still hear the worry in her tone. "You know how people are, Dad. Once they believe a lie, it's hard to change their mind." She was right. Days turned into weeks. The first court summons came. Then the depositions. Lawyers, surveyors, paperwork, all of it ate at my time, my sleep, my peace. Henry's side was cunning. They brought in some out-of-town lawyer, slick and smooth with that smirk that says he'd sell his mother's car if it meant winning a case. They filed motion after motion, trying to drag me into exhaustion. Every night I'd sit at my kitchen table, the same spot where I first opened that lawsuit, and stare out the window toward Henry's house. His lights would be on late, too. I could see him through the blinds sometimes, pacing, drinking. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he was scared. But I knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop, and neither was I. Because beneath the fear and the humiliation, something inside me had started to burn. A slow, steady fire. Not the kind that makes you reckless. The kind that keeps you awake, focused, patient. He thought he could break me by dragging me into court. He didn't realize he'd just given me a reason to fight harder than ever before. And deep down, I made a quiet promise to myself that night, not just to win back my name, but to make sure Henry Miller would regret ever crossing that fence. The morning that envelope landed on my kitchen table, everything inside me went quiet, like the world had paused for a moment to watch me break. The lawsuit papers lay open beside a half-empty cup of coffee, their words printed in bold black letters that felt colder than winter steel. Property encroachment, unlawful occupation. I kept reading those phrases over and over, as if they'd change meaning if I stared hard enough. Henry Miller, my neighbor, the man I once trusted enough to share my tools with him, was suing me. It felt absurd, ridiculous, the kind of thing you read about in those legal columns at the back of the local paper. Not something that happens to you at first. I thought maybe it was a clerical mistake. Maybe the county had mixed something up. Maybe Henry didn't even know about it. That's what I told myself as I picked up the phone. When he answered, I tried to sound calm, even friendly. "Hey, Henry, I just got something strange in the mail." "A lawsuit. It's got your name on it." He didn't even let me finish. His voice came through sharp, bitter, full of old anger I didn't even know existed. "You knew damn well that sheet isn't on your land," he snapped. "You've been trespassing for years, Carter. I've got the old survey to prove it." The words hit me like gravel to the chest. His tone wasn't that of a confused neighbor. It was a man out for blood. "Henry, we can talk about this," I said, my throat tight. "You and I both know that fence has been there long before you even moved in." But he'd already hung up. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone, trying to understand what just happened. The man I'd once helped fix his roof, the man whose wife I'd driven to her doctor's appointments when she was sick, was now painting me as some kind of crook. That night, I called my lawyer, David Nash. We'd known each other since high school. He was a straight shooter, the kind of guy who still said sir to old ladies and brought donuts to court clerks. When he came over the next morning, I had all my property papers spread across the table. He thumbed through the yellowed documents, adjusted his glasses, and sighed. "This is going to be messy, Will," he said quietly. "But you've got solid ground here, literally. Your deed's clean, your boundary markers are consistent, and that shed's been there since before your granddad passed. The law's on your side." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But out in small towns like Auburn Springs, the law isn't always about what's written on paper. It's about who you are, who people believe you to be. And Henry knew that better than anyone. Within days, the rumors started. At the diner, I caught a few folks glancing my way, whispering over their pancakes. At the hardware store, the clerk, who'd known me for 20 years, suddenly became polite but distant. Even at church, the pastor mentioned honesty in our dealings during Sunday's sermon, and I could feel the weight of half the congregation's eyes turning toward me. Henry had been busy. He went around town spinning his story, painting himself as the poor old man whose land was stolen by his greedy neighbor. He even showed people some tattered old survey map, something his father apparently had from the 1970s. Most folks didn't question it. They didn't care about dates or measurements. They just loved a scandal. And small towns feed on scandal like cattle on hay. I'd walk down Main Street and conversations would hush. People I'd mowed lawns for, people I'd helped during storms, they suddenly had doubts. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about my reputation, my name. I remember one afternoon my daughter Emily called from Houston. She'd seen something about it on Facebook. One of Henry's grandkids had posted a smug little rant about land thieves and entitled neighbors. "Dad," she said softly. "Tell me this isn't true." Her voice cracked, and that broke me in a way the lawsuit never could. I told her everything, from the day my grandfather built that shed to the moment I got served. She believed me, but I could still hear the worry in her tone. "You know how people are, Dad. Once they believe a lie, it's hard to change their mind." She was right. Days turned into weeks. The first court summons came, then the depositions. Lawyers, surveyors, paperwork, all of it ate at my time, my sleep, my peace. Henry's side was cunning. They brought in some out-of-town lawyer, slick and smooth, with that smirk that says he'd sell his mother's car if it meant winning a case. They filed motion after motion, trying to drag me into exhaustion. Every night I'd sit at my kitchen table, the same spot where I first opened that lawsuit, and stare out the window toward Henry's house. His lights would be on late, too. I could see him through the blinds sometimes, pacing, drinking. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he was scared. But I knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop, and neither was I. Because beneath the fear and the humiliation, something inside me had started to burn. A slow, steady fire. Not the kind that makes you reckless, the kind that keeps you awake, focused, patient. He thought he could break me by dragging me into court. He didn't realize he'd just given me a reason to fight harder than ever before. And deep down, I made a quiet promise to myself that night, not just to win back my name, but to make sure Henry Miller would regret ever crossing that fence. If you've never been in a small-town courthouse, let me tell you something. They have a smell. A mix of old paper, floor wax, and something faintly like coffee that's been sitting too long. The courthouse in Auburn Springs wasn't fancy. Just a 2-story red brick building with a faded flag out front, creaking doors, and a vending machine that looked like it belonged in a museum. But that morning, when I walked through those double doors with my lawyer, David Nash, it felt like stepping into a battlefield where words were weapons and truth could be twisted until it snapped. The first hearing wasn't about money. It was about ownership, pride, reputation, things that meant a whole lot more to a man my age than any paycheck ever could. Henry was already there when we arrived. He was sitting in the front row beside his fancy Dallas lawyer, a slick-looking fellow in a gray tailored suit and a tie so shiny it looked like he'd ironed it with oil. I remember thinking he didn't belong in a town like ours. He was too polished, too smooth, like a snake that learned to smile. Henry, on the other hand, looked almost humble. Checked shirt tucked in, hands folded in his lap. But when our eyes met, I saw it. That spark of smug satisfaction. The kind of look a man gives when he thinks he's already won. David leaned over and whispered, "Keep calm, Will. Let him talk. The truth's on our side." But I'd seen enough court shows to know truth doesn't always win. Not when pride and money get involved. When the hearing started, the Dallas lawyer strutted up like he owned the place. His voice carried through the courtroom, confident, rehearsed, cold. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a clear case of encroachment. My client, Mr. Miller, has been the rightful owner of the disputed strip of land for over 4 decades. The defendant, Mr. Carter, knowingly built and maintained a structure, a shed, that sits squarely on my client's property. This is not only a violation of boundary law, but a betrayal of neighborly trust." That last phrase hit hard. Betrayal of neighborly trust. The people sitting in the gallery, townsfolk, curious neighbors, even the local reporter from the Auburn Weekly, shifted in their seats. I could feel their eyes on me, judging, wondering if the story they'd been hearing around town was true. Then the lawyer went on, waving around that so-called old survey like it was scripture. "Here's the original map from 1974, he said. "You'll see the boundary line clearly indicates that the disputed structure, this shed, sits on the Miller family's land." He laid it out on the judge's bench like it was a smoking gun. David stood up slowly. No dramatics, no fancy words. Just that calm, quiet confidence he'd always had. "Your Honor," he said, "that survey is outdated and incomplete. My client's property was properly resurveyed in 1985 when his father passed away. The deed and markers match that record, not the one shown by the plaintiff. We also have dated photographs, taken long before Mr. Miller ever moved in, showing the shed standing in the same exact spot." The judge nodded, taking notes. I watched his pen scratch across the paper like it was carving my future. Then Henry took the stand. "I'll admit, I didn't know what to expect. Maybe a nervous neighbor who'd made a mistake. Maybe a man who just wanted to feel in control after losing his wife. But what I saw was something else entirely." He looked calm, rehearsed. Too rehearsed. He started off soft, almost pitiful. "I trusted William," he said, his voice trembling just enough to sound believable. "We were good neighbors. I thought he respected me. But then I found out he'd built his shed on my land, my family's land. I felt betrayed." That word again. Betrayed. The courtroom was silent. Even the air felt still. He went on, voice cracking in all the right places. "I'm not a rich man. I'm just trying to protect what's mine. I didn't want it to come to this, but he left me no choice." I could almost hear the sympathy dripping in the room. Some of the townsfolk even nodded. The man was good. Too good. When my turn came, I stood up, my hands steady but my heart pounding. I looked at the judge, not the crowd, not Henry, and spoke plain. "Your Honor, that shed was built by my grandfather back in 1956. I was just a boy when we poured the foundation. I've lived on that land my whole life. I've never moved that fence, never shifted that boundary." Henry moved in years later. He never said a word until now. David handed me a black and white photo. My grandfather standing next to that very shed, with my father holding a hammer at his side. The judge looked at it for a long time. Then Henry's lawyer tried to twist it. "Mr. Carter, are you suggesting that your grandfather's word should override legal documents?" I took a breath. I'm suggesting that the truth doesn't change just because someone finds an old piece of paper and waves it around, the courtroom murmured. Even the judge lifted an eyebrow. Henry's lawyer looked annoyed. He whispered something to Henry, and Henry just stared at me, jaw tight. That smug look was gone now. After hours of back-and-forth arguments, cross-examinations, and too many legal terms for my liking, the judge finally said, "I'll review both claims and documents. You'll have my verdict within a week." That was it. Just like that. Months of tension and sleepless nights, and it all came down to a week. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed through my chest. Walking out of that courtroom, I didn't feel relief. Just exhaustion. The kind that seeps into your bones. Henry walked right past me in the hallway, his lawyer at his side, both of them smirking like they'd already framed the victory certificate. But as I stepped out into the sunlight, something in me shifted. The courthouse doors swung closed behind me, and I realized I wasn't done fighting. That week became the longest of my life. Every sunrise felt heavy, every night longer than it should have been. I'd wake up thinking about that shed, about my grandfather's calloused hands building it, about my father teaching me how to repair its roof when I was 12. That shed wasn't just a building. It was our history, our legacy. And I'll be damned if I was going to let anyone take that away from me. I've always believed revenge isn't about getting even. It's about restoring balance. But after what Henry put me through, the lies, the humiliation, the way he turned my own community against me, balance wasn't enough. I wanted truth to hit him so hard that it left a mark he'd never forget. At first, I didn't want to play dirty. That's not who I was. My father raised me to believe that a man's character mattered more than his pride. But when someone drags your name through the mud, mocks the memory of your grandfather, and tries to steal the very ground your family built their life on, you stop turning the other cheek. You start fighting back with everything you've got. And that's exactly what I did. David and I spent long nights at his office, papers spread across the desk, maps pinned to the wall, empty coffee cups piling up like battle scars. He had that sharp, calculating look in his eye. The one he used to get back in high school right before winning a debate. "We're not just defending anymore," he said one night, tapping a pen against a folder. "We're going on offense. We started by building a foundation of facts, solid, irrefutable evidence that no lawyer, no matter how slick his suit, could twist." The first breakthrough came from the county archives. Auburn Springs kept old aerial photographs for flood zoning and property assessments. Most of them were grainy, black and white, stored in dusty boxes that hadn't seen daylight in decades. But after hours of squinting under that flickering fluorescent light, I found it. An aerial photo dated 1964. There it was, my grandfather's shed. Plain as day, a small dark square sitting exactly where it stands now. David leaned over my shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, he grinned. That's a time-stamped witness, Will. They can't argue with history. But we didn't stop there. Through a local historian, we tracked down one of the oldest living residents of Auburn Springs, Mr. Harold Jenkins, 82 years old and still sharp as a tack. The man had seen every inch of that town change over the years. He'd been a mail carrier back in the 60s and used to deliver letters to my grandfather. We drove to his little farmhouse on the edge of town. The air smelled like hay and engine oil. Mr. Jenkins sat on his porch in a faded cap, sipping sweet tea, his weathered hands resting on his knees. When we showed him the photo, he squinted for a second, then laughed. A genuine raspy laugh that made my heart jump. "Yup," he said, tapping the photo. "That's been there since before my first kid was born. Your granddaddy built that thing with his own hands. I remember him borrowing my leveler to do it. I swear, hearing that felt like watching a storm finally break after weeks of thunder." "Would you be willing to testify to that in court?" David asked. "Son," Mr. Jenkins said, setting his tea down, "I ain't missed a good fight in 80 years. I'll be there." We thanked him, and on the drive back, David just shook his head and laughed. That old man might just save your legacy. Still, something inside me told me Henry wasn't done. He was desperate, and desperate men don't go down easy. That's when we decided to dig deeper, not just into land records, but into Henry himself. Late one night, while sorting through stacks of property tax documents, David froze. "Will," he said slowly, "you might want to see this." He handed me a file. It was a tax summary, nothing fancy. But the numbers didn't line up. Henry's been filing for a homestead exemption, David said. 2 of them, I frowned. Is that bad? It's illegal, he said. In Texas, you can only claim 1 homestead exemption. It's meant for your primary residence. It lowers your taxes, but Henry's got 2. 1 here and another on some rental property over in Denton County. I leaned back in my chair, stunned. You're saying he's been cheating the state? Not just cheating, committing fraud. If this gets out, he could lose both exemptions, get fined, maybe even face charges. That was it. That was the ace. Everything he'd done suddenly looked different. His fake moral high ground, his performance in court, his fake tears. It all came from a man trying to hide his own mess. While he was busy painting me as a land thief, he was the one robbing the system. David grinned. You still want to play fair? I stared at the papers for a long moment. Then I shook my head. No, David, I want to play smart. We built our plan like clockwork, piece by piece. First, we quietly filed a formal inquiry with the county assessor's office, requesting confirmation of Henry's exemption claims. David handled that part. He knew exactly how to keep it under wraps until the right moment. Next, we organized all the evidence, the aerial photos, Mr. Jenkins' sworn affidavit, the property tax inconsistencies, even the lien documents I'd found earlier. Each piece told a story. Each one chipped away at the fake image Henry had built. Then came the finishing touch, a little detail that still makes me smile when I think about it. See? I'd noticed that Henry's fancy lawyer liked to brag in the local paper. Every time he won a case, he'd send a press release to the Auburn Weekly. I decided to feed him something he couldn't resist. Through an old friend who worked at the paper, we slipped a little rumor that I'd backed out of the case, that I was ready to settle. Within 2 days, Henry was walking taller again, smug as ever. I'd see him at the post office, humming to himself like a man who thought victory was already signed and sealed. What he didn't know was that David and I were preparing to detonate everything he'd built, right in the middle of the courtroom. And when that day came, when the truth came crashing down on him in front of everyone who once believed his lies, it wouldn't just end his lawsuit. It would end him, not in a violent way, not in a cruel way, in the way that truth ends a lie, loud, undeniable, and final. Because Henry Miller thought he was fighting for land. But what he didn't know was that I was fighting for something far bigger. My name, my family, and the legacy of a man who built that shed with his bare hands. And this time, I wasn't going to lose. The day of reckoning arrived wrapped in the same kind of cold gray morning that makes the whole world feel suspended, like the calm before a storm. The courthouse loomed in front of me, its stone facade streaked by years of weather and history, the flag outside fluttering just faintly against the pale sky. I could feel the weight of every step as I climbed those front stairs, boots scuffing the edges worn down by decades of other men's battles. I wasn't nervous anymore. That part of me, the part that used to tremble before confrontation, had burned away over the past few months. What was left was something sharper, quieter, and far more dangerous. David walked beside me, his briefcase in hand, his expression calm but his eyes gleaming with that quiet fire of certainty. He knew what we were about to do wasn't just about winning a case. It was about restoring a man's name that someone had tried to drag through the dirt. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. A handful of locals had gathered, drawn in by the small-town hunger for drama. The air was thick with whispers. Henry sat across from me at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a dark suit that didn't quite fit right. His wife was there too, looking down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. For months, he'd strutted through this town like he owned it, but now, for the first time, I saw the cracks in that confident mask. He looked smaller somehow, a man about to face a truth he couldn't twist his way out of. When the judge entered, the room rose. She was a stern woman, mid-60s with sharp eyes that could slice through any performance. Court is now in session, she said, her voice steady, powerful. Case number 21-184, Miller versus Cole. David rose slowly. Your Honor, he began. Today we intend to show not only the truth about the disputed land boundary, but the pattern of deceit that brought us here. He laid out the evidence like a story unfolding, each piece falling into place with the precision of a craftsman. First came the aerial photographs, decades old. Black and white images that showed my grandfather's shed standing proud in the same spot long before Henry Miller had even bought his property. David placed the enlarged photo on the easel facing the courtroom. "This," he said, pointing, "is a county-verified image from 1964. The structure in question, the shed Mr. Miller claims was built over his property line, is clearly visible here, predating his ownership by over 30 years." There was a murmur in the crowd. Henry's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, already sensing the tide turning. Next came Mr. Jenkins, the 82-year-old neighbor we'd tracked down. He walked to the stand with slow, deliberate steps, leaning slightly on his cane. The courtroom fell quiet when he raised his hand to take the oath. "Mr. Jenkins," David began, "you've lived in Auburn Springs for how long?" "Since 1959, the old man replied, his voice raspy but firm. "Do you recognize this photo?" David asked, holding up the same aerial picture. Mr. Jenkins squinted, then chuckled softly. "Sure do, there's the Cole property. That shed's been standing since before my first boy was born. Your granddaddy built it himself. I lent him my tools." A few people in the back smiled. Even the judge's stern face softened a bit. There was something undeniable about an old man's certainty, a witness whose memory stretched back further than any document could. Henry's lawyer tried to rattle him with questions, but Mr. Jenkins was unshakable. "I know what I saw," he said simply. "That shed's always been right where it is." Then came the property tax records. David presented them methodically, line by line, receipt by receipt, proving beyond doubt that our family had paid taxes on that land continuously, without fail for generations. By that point, Henry was starting to sweat. I could see it, the slight tremor in his hands, the way he leaned forward as if hoping to intimidate the evidence into submission. But then came the moment that cracked everything open. David straightened his notes, looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, there's one final piece of evidence we need to present, something that speaks directly to Mr. Miller's credibility in this matter." Henry's lawyer shot up immediately. "Objection, Your Honor." "Relevance?" The judge frowned. "Let him proceed, counselor. I'll decide what's relevant." David walked to the evidence table, picked up a single sheet of paper and held it up. "This document," he said clearly, "is a certified record from the Texas County Tax Assessor's Office. It confirms that Mr. Henry Miller has been claiming a homestead exemption on 2 separate properties for the past 4 years, one in Auburn Springs and another in Denton County." The room froze. You could have heard a pin drop. Henry's lawyer's mouth opened, then shut again. "Objection," he barked, his voice rising. This is irrelevant character assassination." But the judge had already leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Miller," she said slowly, "is this true?" Henry's face turned pale. He stammered, his hands fumbling with his tie. "Well, I didn't realize it was a mistake. I didn't." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Miller, that's not a minor oversight. Filing for dual homestead exemptions is a violation of Texas law. You are aware of that, aren't you?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop spinning. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The truth was standing there, plain and heavy, and everyone could feel it pressing down. Henry, the man who had tried to brand me as dishonest, was now drowning in his own lies, right there under the same oath he had demanded of me. The judge looked over at David. "I've seen enough," she said finally. "This court dismisses the plaintiff's claims in their entirety." Henry's lawyer sank into his seat, but the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, "I am ordering that Mr. Miller's tax filings be referred to the county for investigation. If these records are accurate, there will be serious consequences." Henry's head dropped. His wife covered her face with trembling hands. And just like that, months of lies, manipulation, and humiliation came to an end. The gavel struck. "Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I sat there for a moment, frozen, letting the sound wash over me, the hum of whispered justice, the shuffle of chairs, the distant creak of the courthouse doors opening as people filed out. David placed a hand on my shoulder and smiled. "It's over, Will." But in truth, it wasn't over, not yet. Justice has a way of echoing. It keeps rolling long after the verdict. 2 weeks later, the official notice came. Henry's case was formally dismissed, and the county had launched a full audit into his property exemptions. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Auburn Springs was a small town. Gossip traveled faster than wind. The man who once stood tall at every community event now avoided the grocery store altogether. His business partners pulled out of deals. His name, once spoken with respect, now carried a bitter aftertaste. 3 months later, his land, that same parcel he had fought so desperately to keep, went up for auction to cover unpaid fines and penalties. And when the auctioneer's gavel fell that day, I was standing in the crowd. The wind was sharp, the sun bright. I raised my hand quietly at the final call. Sold, the auctioneer declared. The land that Henry had tried to take from me, the soil he used to curse my name over, now belonged to me, legally, cleanly, and finally. As I walked across that familiar patch of earth afterward, I looked toward the old shed. The wood had aged, but it still stood strong, just like my family's name. Revenge, I realized, didn't always come with fury or fire. Sometimes it came with silence, with truth, with the slow, satisfying weight of justice landing right where it should. And that day, as the sun sank behind the hill, painting the land in gold and shadow, I finally felt peace, and not just for me, but for the generations before me who had built, worked, and fought for every inch of that ground. The truth had done what anger never could. It restored everything. The morning of the auction came with a pale, washed-out sky and a quietness that didn't quite feel real. The kind of quiet that sits in your chest like a held breath. I remember stepping out onto my porch, the same porch where months earlier I'd been handed that lawsuit, and watching the mist lift from the trees. The air had that earthy smell of dew and soil, familiar, grounding. It was the kind of morning my grandfather used to call a day for settling old business. I hadn't planned to go at first. The whole ordeal, the courtroom, the whispers, the sleepless nights, had drained me dry. Part of me wanted to just let it all go, to turn my back on that cursed strip of land and everything that had come with it. But another part, the stubborn one I inherited from my father, wouldn't rest easy until I made things right all the way through. So I shaved, put on my old leather jacket, and drove down to the county auction lot. The place was small, just a gravel clearing behind the courthouse, with folding chairs lined in uneven rows. Maybe 20 people had gathered, most of them familiar faces. Local farmers, small investors, a few curious townsfolk who came to see what drama might unfold. The auctioneer, a broad man with a red face and a booming voice, was setting up on a wooden platform, his gavel resting beside a worn clipboard. The property list was short that day, but I knew why most of those people were there. Henry Miller's name had been on everyone's tongue for weeks. The man who lost his case. The man whose land was up for grabs. When I saw the sign reading Parcel 11B, former Miller residence, my chest tightened. That was it. 40 feet and then some. The same patch of earth that had cost me months of stress, nights of bitterness, and the illusion that I ever truly knew my neighbor. I spotted a few faces from town whispering, their eyes flicking between me and the sign. I didn't care. I wasn't there for gossip. I was there to make sure that land, my grandfather's land by blood and by right, didn't fall into hands that would trample its history. The bidding started low, opening at $15,000. The auctioneer called, his voice echoing through the crisp morning air. A man in the front row raised his hand, then another. The numbers started to climb in steady, practiced rhythm, 17, 18, 20. I waited. My heart beat slow, steady. I could almost hear my lawyer David's voice in the back of my head, calm and certain. If you're gonna do this, do it clean. No emotion, just business. When the price hit 25, I raised my hand. The crowd went still for a moment. Everyone knew who I was. Everyone remembered what had happened. You could feel it, the curiosity, the silent surprise. The auctioneer looked down at me, half smiling, half wary. Bid of $25,000 from Mr. Carter. Do I hear 26? Someone hesitated, then shook their head. Another tried for 26, but I didn't blink. I went straight to 28. My voice was calm, my face unreadable. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. 28,000 going once. Going twice. The pause hung there, thick and final. Sold. To Mr. William Carter. The sound of that gavel striking wood wasn't just an end. It was an echo, closing the last chapter of a war I never asked for. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just stood there for a moment, letting the noise fade into the morning air. That strange feeling, not triumph, not victory, washed over me. It was quieter, deeper. It was peace. The kind that doesn't shout or sparkle but settles inside you like a slow exhale after a long storm. When I signed the papers and received the deed, my hands didn't shake. It felt natural, like I was simply restoring something that had been lost. Afterward, I drove out to the property. The road was muddy from the rain, the ditches filled with yellow grass bending in the wind. Henry's old house stood there like a wounded animal. Windows boarded, paint peeling, the porch sagging where years of neglect had set in. The for sale sign was gone now, replaced by silence. I parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The air smelled faintly of cedar and rust. Birds scattered from the eaves when I walked up to the fence. My fence, the one my grandfather and father had built with their own hands. It was old but solid, the nails still gripping the wood with quiet pride. I placed my hand on the top rail, tracing the grooves and cracks worn into it by time. Beyond it, the shed still stood, leaning, weathered but unbroken. It had watched everything, generations of laughter, loss, and love, and now, this final reckoning. For a long while I just stood there, staring at that shed. I thought of Henry, of the man he used to be before greed and fear hollowed him out. There was a time when he'd come by with a beer in his hand, laughing about football or swapping stories about old jobs. I remembered how his face changed after his wife died, how bitterness had crept in like rot under paint. Maybe that's what started it all. Maybe grief twisted him into someone I couldn't recognize anymore. I didn't hate him. Not anymore. Hate burns too bright, and I was tired of fire. What I felt was something else, a kind of heavy understanding. Life doesn't always split clean between good men and bad ones. Sometimes it's just two broken people standing on opposite sides of a fence that neither of them built. As I walked toward the shed, my boots sinking softly into the damp earth, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the wind. "Take care of what's yours, will, but never let it own you." I smiled faintly. For the first time in months, maybe years, that advice made perfect sense. The sun broke through the clouds then, spilling light across the land, golden and wide, touching every blade of grass, every nail in that old shed. It felt like the earth itself was exhaling, like even the soil knew something had finally been set right. I knelt down, pressed my hand against the ground, and whispered, "We're home." When I stood up, I glanced once more toward Henry's old house. The windows were dark, lifeless. Kids sometimes came around to throw stones at it, not knowing the story buried beneath those rotting boards. To them it was just an abandoned place, something to laugh at on their way home. But I knew better. That land was more than a cautionary tale. It was a lesson written in sweat and pride and hard-earned truth. The kind of lesson that reminds you that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, and when it comes, it doesn't need applause. It just needs peace. I walked back to my truck as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and cut grass. Behind me, the shed stood tall under the morning sun, stubborn as ever, like it was watching over the land one last time. I turned the key, started the engine, and looked out the window for a final glance. That patch of ground, the same soil that once divided two men, now felt whole again. Mine, at last, not taken by force, not won by pride, but earned and through truth, patience, and the quiet, steady weight of justice finding its way home. It's strange how quiet the world can feel once a storm passes. You spend months bracing yourself for thunder, sleepless nights pacing the floor, your head filled with arguments, fears, and what-ifs, and then suddenly one morning, you wake up and realize it's all gone. No more court dates, no more lawyers, no more neighbors measuring your fence with a tape and a grudge. Just silence, the kind that feels like peace, not absence. I didn't win because I was smarter. God knows I've made enough mistakes in my life to prove otherwise. I didn't win because I had more money, or better friends, or even luck. I won because I refused to break. Because I held on to patience when anger wanted to take the wheel. Because I kept believing, stubbornly, foolishly maybe, that truth, no matter how deep you bury it under lies, always finds a way to rise back up through the dirt. Just like grass after a storm. Now my mornings look a lot like they did before everything began, but they feel different. I still get up before the sun, Still pour that same strong cup of black coffee. Still stand on the porch with my old dog at my side, listening to the birds start their day. But when I look out now, there's something steadier in my chest. The fence line stretches across the land like a scar that's healed right. Clean even, no longer splitting my peace in half. Beyond it, the shed sits where it always has, stubborn and proud, its roof patched up, its door freshly painted. I rebuilt it myself the week after the auction. Not because it needed it, but because I needed it. Needed to remind myself that some things, no matter how weathered, can be made new again if you care enough to fix them. Sometimes, I catch myself staring out over that land for too long, thinking about all the years that passed on it, my kids running barefoot through the grass, my wife hanging laundry in the wind, my father showing me how to set a fence post straight. That soil holds more than just roots. It holds memories. It holds everything we've fought for, and I think about Henry. I don't hate the man. Truth is, I stopped hating him the day I bought his land. It would have been easy to gloat, to rub salt in his wounds, to see my victory as payback. But what I felt instead was a kind of tired empathy, like watching an old bull finally lay down in the field after too many years of fighting fences. I heard he left Auburn Springs for good. Some folks said he moved in with his sister out in Oklahoma. Others say he's in a small apartment near Dallas. I don't know. I don't need to. Because his story, whatever it became, stopped being tied to mine the moment that gavel hit wood. Still, sometimes when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear his hammer echoing faintly from those early years. When he was still fixing his porch, still smiling, still the man who used to wave over the fence with a half-empty beer can and a nod. Maybe that's just memory playing tricks. Or maybe it's a reminder that even good men can lose themselves if they let bitterness steer the way. People around town still bring it up sometimes, especially new folks who move in and hear the story. You're the guy who ended up owning his neighbor's land, right? They say half curious, half impressed. I always smile politely, shrug, and tell them, it's not something to brag about. It's something to learn from. Because here's the truth. Winning doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like closure. And sometimes it feels like finally setting down a weight you didn't realize you'd been carrying. The land is quiet now. Peaceful. The kind of peace you can hear. The soft rustle of oak leaves. The whistle of wind through the fence. The distant hum of a tractor down the road. My days move slower, but not in a lonely way. More like deliberate. Grounded, I've started gardening again. Tomatoes, a few peppers, even a row of sunflowers just for the color. My daughter visits on weekends, brings the grandkids. They run around chasing each other through the yard, their laughter spilling across the same soil that once held so much tension. Sometimes they ask why the house next door looks empty, why the windows are boarded up. I just smile and tell them, that house is sleeping. They don't need to know the rest. They don't need to hear about betrayal or lawsuits or bitterness. What they'll remember is the laughter, the warmth, the good things. That's enough. When people ask me what I learned from it all, I tell them this. Never mistake silence for weakness. Some of us just wait for the right moment to speak, because silence can be strength. It can be the calm before the truth comes roaring out. It can be the patience that wins when shouting never could. I learned that standing your ground doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means enduring. Sometimes it means letting others spin their lies until they tangle themselves in them. And sometimes it means believing so fiercely in what's right that even when the world doubts you, you keep standing tall because time has a way of proving who was true all along. Now, as the sun sets each evening, I sit out back with that same cup of coffee gone cold in my hand, watching the golden light spill across my land, the land that's now, fully and forever mine. I don't feel anger anymore. I don't feel pride. Just gratitude. Gratitude that truth still matters, that patience still pays, and that peace, real peace, comes not from taking revenge, but from knowing you never lost yourself trying to win. And if I've learned anything worth passing on, it's this. You can rebuild fences. You can restore land. But the most important thing you'll ever reclaim is your own peace. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always roar. It doesn't have to be a blaze that burns bright and quick. For a long while I pictured it that way, like something spectacular, a thunderbolt that would strike and settle everything at once. What I finally came to understand, sitting on that porch with the evening wind ruffling the curtains and my hands wrapped around a cooling mug of coffee, was that the quiet kind of revenge is the one that lasts. It arrives patient, steady, made of small facts and slow persistence. It's not glamorous. It's not satisfying to parade around, but it is thorough. It sees the long arc of time and follows it until the truth stands naked and unmistakable. Henry tried to ruin my name. He paraded the old survey like it was gospel, played on people's sympathies, and let rumor do most of his work. He thought a few whispered lies and a polished lawyer could unsettle a life built over generations. He forgot, though, that some things aren't erased by gossip. The sweat in the ground where a man planted fence posts with his own hands, the ink on tax receipts that showed decades of payment, the memory of neighbors who remember when a thing was first put in place. Those are stubborn things. They don't change because someone phrases a lie with enough conviction. They remain, patient and waiting like seeds under snow. When the dust settled and the county papers signed my name on the deed, I didn't dance in the street. There was a slow, settling kind of peace that moved through me. The sensation you get when a long-held worry finally folds up and goes back into its box. I felt relief, sure. I felt the satisfaction of righting a long wrong. But most of all, I felt tired in a good way. Like the kind of weariness you have after mending a fence all day and seeing it stand straighter than before. People have asked me since then if I felt vindictive when I bought that property at auction. They wonder if I wanted to rub salt in Henry's wounds. The truth is more complicated and a little more ordinary. I bought the land because it belonged in my mind and in the ledger of our family's life beside my house. It had witnessed my children's first steps, my wife's laughter, my father's stories. Letting it slip into someone else's hands, even into the hands of someone I once called neighbor and friend, didn't feel like revenge so much as a loss I wasn't willing to accept. The transaction sealed something practical and sentimental both, the preservation of a family place and the closure of a long, ugly chapter. What I keep coming back to in the quiet hours is how much the town changed while all this was going on. People who had known me for years found it hard to believe that I could be the villain in someone else's tale. Some stood by me from the start. Others wavered and then returned when the truth came out. It taught me that reputations are both fragile and resilient. Fragile because a rumor can trip you up. Resilient because the substance of who you are tends to show itself in the end. That resilience doesn't happen because of a single moment of vindication. It happens because of years of steady, ordinary behavior. There's no headline for that. There's no thrill reel. It's just life, paying taxes, greeting the mail carrier, fixing a sagging gate. Those things add up. I don't pretend to be holier than Henry. I saw a man break under the weight of his losses, his wife's death, financial mistakes, pride. I watched bitterness creep in like ivy, slow and insidious until it covered everything good that had once been there. I felt anger at times, yes, and there were nights when I wanted to shout, to tear down his claims with words sharp enough to cut. But when the shouting passed, what remained was the knowledge that creating more ruin wouldn't rebuild anything that mattered. So I chose a different route. Evidence, patience, the stubborn grind of paperwork, and witness statements. That felt less cinematic and more honest. Karma is a funny thing people throw around in the diner when their coffee goes cold. They like the idea that the world has a sort of moral accounting ledger. And sometimes, after all the forms and hearings and headaches, it seems like that's how things line up. But I don't chalk this up to some cosmic bookkeeping. I chalk it up to cause and effect. You plant vines of deceit, and sooner or later they strangle the very thing you thought you were protecting. You stand on the truth and water it, and it grows roots so deep they can't be pulled up by a rumor. There's less mystery to it than people like to believe and more plain consequence. Life after the fight returned to ordinary rhythms. Mornings are still my favorite time. Cool air, coffee smoking in the cup, the fence line looking steady under the early light. I mend what needs mending. I talk to passing neighbors and I listen to my grandchildren's laughs as they chase after the dog. My hands know the work of the land and the way to heal it, and that knowledge is a kind of inheritance I now guard even more carefully. If there's a lesson I'd pass on, it's this: don't mistake silence for weakness. Some people mistake the quiet man in the corner for someone who won't act. That's a mistake. Sometimes the quiet man is watching, cataloging, preparing the right time to speak. Patience is not passivity. It's a different kind of power. It gives you the chance to gather evidence, to preserve your dignity, and to respond with things that matter in the long run. It's easier said than done, especially when your name is being dragged through the dirt, but it works more often than people realize. Another thing I say to folks now, especially to younger men who want quick action and immediate wins, is this: keep a record. Photographs, receipts, old tax bills, a neighbor's recollection. These are the real tools of preservation. They don't look heroic in a movie, but they're the things that stand up in a courtroom and in life. Build your life so that when someone tries to shake it, there's something solid to hold on to. At the end of the day, I went back to being the man I was before this whole mess. Stubborn, yes, maybe a little set in my ways, but also softer now in the places that count. I've stopped looking for hostility in every glance. I keep the lawn mowed. I water the tomatoes. I fix the roof when it leaks. The world is full of petty fights and grand ones alike, but most of the important battles are quietly won by doing the slow, right thing over and over again. Because when life drags you to court, when it makes you defend what's yours not just with anger but with paperwork and patience and truth, sometimes the best revenge isn't to shout louder or strike harder. Sometimes the best revenge is to survive the noise, to let truth do the heavy lifting, and to stand back on the land you fought for with nothing left to prove. Owning that ground wasn't a trophy for me. It was a return to who I was, a man tied to a place by history and love, not by headline or spectacle. So, when people ask me what I'd say to someone walking into a similar fight, I tell them plainly, hold steady. Keep your records close. Trust the truth to outlast the lie. And remember that patience can be a fiercer weapon than any quick strike. The earth beneath your feet remembers your story long after the gossip fades. And if you care for it, it will remember you kindly in return.